Welcome along to Obsession Engineering, and it's time to start a new project. And this one has been lurking in the background in the workshop for a while. If I'm honest, I can't actually remember when I bought this project. But a mate of mine sent me a link to eBay where somebody was selling this bike. And they knew I'd like this bike, and it wasn't a lot of money, and it had been 3/4 restored already. But that means there's probably 3/4 of the work still to go. And so, of course, I collected the bike and I put it in the corner. And that's where it stayed for a long time. It's been used to put things on top. It's been used to hide things behind. It has definitely not been used as a motorbike. But that is going to change. Because somebody's done most of the restoration work on it already, it shouldn't need too much doing. And when I bought it, I did actually have it started for about 3 seconds. But it did run, so I know it is capable of functioning. But again, that was quite a long time ago, so things might have changed since then. There has also been quite a lot of people guessing what it was under the cover, because every now and again a little bit would just peek out at you. So now I shall take the cover off and show you what's next. Ta-da! It's a ZXR 400. And if I move the camera, we'll actually be able to see it better. So this is it, my 3/4 restored ZXR 400 project. I mean, it's got pink and purple on the graphics, so you can tell it's from the 90s. But there's a bit of an oddity with this. This one is on early bodywork, so this bodywork would be 1992, I believe. But the bike is 1999. But we know it's been a bit of a project, so we know everything's been apart and put back together. And what they've tried to do, the person who did most of the project, was actually try and get a full set of panels that matched and not really worry about whether the right year or not. It has also had the bike stripped down to the frame. The frame has been painted. Not sure how good the paint is, so there might be a little run of something there that might have affected it already. But it looks pretty reasonable. The wheels have been powder coated. It has a new chain and sprockets on it. It is missing the rubber off the footrest. It's got some horrendous carbon effect levers on it. There's a brake caliper missing off this side, but we'll get to that in a minute. The forks have got a little misting on them, but they're probably not too bad. Inside there, the radiator is very crusty, but overall, the bike's not in bad shape. So when I bought the bike, I paid a stunning £950 for it. And I think that's not bad going. So what I'm planning to do with this is to get it on the road, running, riding, and doing everything it should do on a nice small budget. And I can let you into a secret that will involve a future project as well. This isn't the only ZXR 400 I've got. I've also got a race bike one, which I bought to do the classic TT on. Then I stopped racing. But my friend Stuart did borrow it and do the Manx Grand Prix on it. And so that's another project later on. I'm hoping I can turn this around relatively quickly and for not too much money, but there are definitely going to be a few things needed, which I may have been hoarding over the last several years. So between this bike and all the bits I've hoarded for the race bike, I've ended up with a random selection of road bits. I have a footrest with the rubber still on it, left-hand trim panel that fits inside the fairing, the correct headlight, or at least I hope it's correct. The headlight in the bike, bizarrely, is a square one, and they're not supposed to be. And so it's going to get changed for this one, and I'm just hoping this one dips the right way for UK. A chain guard that was in my box of ZXR bits, but is not ZXR 400. A mile-per-hour clock. In this bag, there are bits of carburettor, float valves and such like. Because when I bought the bike, I was told the carbs had been rebuilt. But I did buy a full set of float gaskets, because I am going to have the carbs apart and ultrasonic them anyway. We also then have spark plugs, an oil filter, a random indicator that I don't know whether I need it or not, but we've got it. And in this bag, there is a set of Chinese coolant hoses. The Chinese coolant hoses will be going with the Chinese radiator that's in this box, because the radiator that's on the bike is very crusty. So that's going to work and actually cool the engine down. Between a selection of these bits and quite a lot of hours, hopefully we can get the ZXR 400 on the road without spending a fortune or taking too long over it. Of course, it's easy for things to go missing when you're not building a project, but luckily I still have the key for this, and it works perfectly in the ignition. I mean, the battery's completely flat, but I do have a key. Unfortunately, the key does not seem to work in the fuel tank. I have had the fuel tank off, the fuel cap open before, so I know I have had a key, and I also know the fuel tank is completely full of rust. So one of the early jobs is to get that fuel cap open. But while I was rooting around, I found another key. Yeah, this doesn't fit anything either. I have absolutely no idea what the bike this is off. Ah yes, I nearly forgot the story of the brake calipers. So, the brake calipers have been stripped, shot blasted, and made to look quite nice. Then when we got the race bike project in, we snapped a bleed nipple off. And it was becoming a bit of a pain, so we just nicked the caliper off the left-hand side of this. And so now we don't have a matching pair of calipers. And so what we are going to do is nick the calipers back off the race bike, and then the race bike's getting an upgrade. So obviously if I'm going to upgrade one set of calipers, we're going to upgrade the race bike, and then this little old girl can have the standard calipers back. But I know what you're saying, less talk, more action. So let's try and get into that fuel tank. Turns out that key does actually fit in that lock, but it's obviously been getting a bit of condensation in there over the past several years, and the lock's got a bit furry, so a bit of lube down the keyhole and a little bit of working forward and back, and it does actually now work, which means we definitely need to strip that down and actually give it a bit of a clean up. But the bigger problem is in there, because that's very crusty. To combat the rust problem, it's going to be a three-stage job. We've got some Tank Cure rust remover. We've used this on a couple of fuel tanks before. That is fairly potent stuff at getting rid of rust, and then basically you use a cleaner to get rid of any last little bit, and then you've got an E10 compatible epoxy petrol tank sealant. So you mix the two halves together, swirl it around the tank, job's a good one. So if you fancy yourself a sort of beginner project, a 90s Japanese bike is a good place to start. The engineering is fairly straightforward, there is generally room to work on everything, and a lot of the bits are either available new still, or there's still second-hand parts about. So if you fancy a project, something like an old ZXR, pretty good place to start. To actually get the fuel tank off the ZXR is pretty straightforward. A couple of bolts at the back, and there's two at the front, one either side, under the plastic cover, so we just need to buzz the little plastic cover off. The air tubes will just slide out. So the tank itself is pretty straightforward. It is easier if you take the side panels off though, because it gives you a bit more room to lift the tank up. And to get the side panels off, the front seat's easy, it just bolts at the front and slides in. The rear seat, which is now off, that clips in and actually locks into place, and I don't have a key for the lock. But what I do have is fingers that are long enough to go under here, where the cable runs, and because the end has come loose on the cable, when I pull the cable like that, it released the lock just enough to actually take the seat off. Seat side panels are off, and there is a bit of a difference. That one has a later sticker because it's got colour in it. That one's got an early sticker. And also, this one doesn't have a hole in the top, and this one does. Because the later bikes had a very 90s little spoiler on them. Didn't do anything. It could be used as a grab rail if you had very small fingers. It just kind of looked cool. I don't need it. I would have quite liked it, but if we're going 92 style, then what I need is a matching side panel to go with that one, which I've already ordered on eBay. So fingers crossed it turns up and it isn't horrible. Because this bike's already been apart and mostly put back together by somebody who was actually paying attention, most of the fasteners have been changed for stainless, which just gives it a slightly nicer look. Again, not original, but we don't care about that when there's upgrades involved. Tank is off, and when the fuel tap looks that rusty, the insides of the tank are clearly not going to be great. But it was holding fuel, and the fuel tap I think might have actually been rebuilt because it seemed to be functioning because there was fuel in the tank. And when I say fuel, I think what we need nowadays is vinegar. So I'll see if one of the lads in the office wants some petrol for his car. I mean, it is free. So I've done a little prep work on the fuel tank, and the first thing I've done is moved into our little machine shop at the back with the heaters blowing, because this will probably work better at room temperature. And I mean, every room has a temperature, but the main workshop room is mostly cold, so I've moved somewhere slightly warmer. Now that the filler cap actually works, I can close that when I need to. Underneath the tank I found a little piece of scrap aluminium, put a couple of holes in it so that that bolts in where the fuel tap would have been to blank the tank off. I don't want to leave the fuel tap in because the stuff we're going to use to remove the rust may well melt it. I've also drilled an extra hole, put a bolt in with a copper washer. The idea of that is I can then use that as my draining point to get the rust remover out of the tank, easier than doing this and all the fluid falling out as I'm trying to unbolt it. And if I then need to put the rust remover back in, I haven't disturbed the sealant I've put underneath the plate. Practical thinking. So, next thing to do then is put this upright, put my tank rust remover in it, give it a good swill around, and it does say to leave it in for several hours. And so just in case the tank leaks, I'm actually going to do it on the floor over a tub, so it doesn't just dribble onto the floor and ruin whatever is on the floor. With the fuel tank underway, it's now time to take off the rest of the bodywork, which frankly doesn't actually take very long. A couple of fasteners at the top, one on the side panel, one down there, a couple at the bottom. Easy! The nose cone I think is pretty similar as well. A couple of headlight connectors and out it'll come. Yeah, this should be pretty quick. Taking the bodywork off really was as easy as I expected. Made even easier by the fact that nothing was uptight because it had only basically been put together to transport to me. Have found an oddity though. Headlight, only one connector in the loom because I think it's maybe a Japanese spec wiring loom. So that's why it's got a square headlight in it. But I don't want that headlight. But I have got a scrap wiring loom upstairs with another of these connectors on it, and so I'm going to do a bit of wiring in at some point, and then I can fit the headlight I actually want on the bike. And the next thing I'm going to do is drop all the fluids out of it, because even though the oil probably hasn't actually been used since it's been in the bike, it has been in there several years. So that'll need changing anyway. Going to give it a valve clearance service just to be on the safe side, and we're taking the radiator off, so I do need to drain all the fluids out. So that is next job. Sat behind the plastic sort of panel infill trim piece, there is a drain point on the water pump. But instead of draining there, I'm just going to split the pipework here and let it all drain out because I'm changing all the pipework anyway, so it makes sense to just start pulling all that apart. And to get the engine oil out of it, there's a bolt there. It's on the side stand, so it's even better because it will drain this way. Fluids out, radiator off, and then I'll buzz the airbox off so I can get to the rocker cover so I can start looking at valve clearances. Engine oil is draining. I mean, it looks clean, but it has been in there a while. Radiator off. That looked clean but was incredibly crusty, and now I've got that off, I've found a few other details. The coils are supposed to be located in well nuts that sit in the frame, but the well nuts always fall out of the frame and your coils sort of fall out and dangle on top of the engine, which is not ideal. But when we get in to do the valve clearances, we can sort those out as well. The original ZX4 engine, which then got carried into the ZXR 400H model, didn't have an oil cooler. It's only the L models that had the oil cooler, and because of that, there's actually a little bypass sort of pipe inside the engine. And so what you can do is just take the oil cooler off and blank the two port points off, and then you don't need any of this. And okay, your oil runs slightly warmer, but it's a really common mod, nobody seems to ever have a problem with it, and even the race bike one has no oil cooler. And so I'm going to take the oil cooler off. And so I've got to get an Allen key onto some screws which are up here behind the exhaust pipes. So I'm going to hopefully be able to get to them. If it comes to it, it's not that big a job to just take the exhaust pipes off, because all the bolts actually look alright up here. I decided it was just easier to take the exhaust pipes off. One of the studs, the nut was a bit rounded off, but once I got a socket on that fitted quite nicely, it just pulled the stud out, so that's absolutely no problem. We'll replace that before we put it all back together. One of the other studs came out as well, but that's not really an issue. Oil cooler off. One of the cap screws was a bit rounded off, so we got the mole grips on it because access was pretty good. So that is bottom half of the engine basically clear. So moving on to the top half of the engine, I've undone the bolts that hold the airbox on, and that is the airbox off. And to do the valve clearances, I probably don't really need to take the carbs off, because I can get to the rocker cover pretty easily in there. Coils off, I mean they've half taken themselves off already, and then it's basically 4 bolts to undo the rocker cover and just slide that off. But I'm going to take the carbs off anyway because they're going to need a clean and a bit of attention. So the next thing to do is get behind them, undo the little clamps that are down here with a long screwdriver, and then we'll pop the carbs off and see what state they're in at some point. So to get in to do the valve cleanser, all I need to do is take out the 4 bolts that hold the rocker cover on, and then that will just lift up and come straight back out this way. I mean, it might have to wiggle it past that wiring loom, but I don't imagine it's going to take much effort. If necessary, I can even just go forwards where the radiator used to be. So much space. Cam cover is off, and I've also taken the spark plugs out that live down those holes because it will make it easier to turn the engine over. The next thing we need to do is get some of the cams, like here, we need to get that so that the pointy bit of the cam, the lobe, is sticking straight up. So that the base circle, the sort of smaller diameter bit at the bottom, is against the rocker arm down here. And to turn the engine over, we're going to do it with the bolt in the end of the crank. You can take the alternator cover off and do it that side, but this side, this engine, doesn't have loads and loads of sort of valve spring tension, so it should turn over relatively easily just using the bolt on this side. And as I say that, you can see the cam at number 2 exhaust is coming up, so we want the lobe, the sticky up bit, basically at the top, which is going to be about there, and that means we can then get a feeler gauge in between the base circle of the cam and the rocker arm, or between the rocker arm and the actual shim, and measure the clearance. To make access a little bit easier, I've taken the extensions off that go down to the spark plug tunnels as well. So, feeler gauge, yes, I'm using the end that's normally held in the retainer because my other end I've had to trim off and it doesn't go in as easy. So, there we go, right. In there, that's a 0.15 feeler gauge. It goes in, but it's not loose. So we'll see if a 0.2 goes in. 0.2 feeler gauge, doesn't go in the hole, doesn't go in the hole. So I'd call that about 0.17. So with my piece of paper marked out with each cylinder and basically each valve location, I'll put 1.7 on there, 1.7. Once you get going, it's relatively quick to actually measure them, especially on this bike because you can get in to see everything. Everything is in tolerance. A couple of them are on the top limit, but that's fine. These ZXR 400s aren't unknown for wearing the rocker arm. So they basically wear through the chrome plating on the rocker arm and then wear the rocker away. And that gives you a really, really big valve clearance. So not only does that get annoying and rattly, but also the nice gentle off-ramp on the lobe, it ends up not using, so it ends up dropping the valve onto the seat quite hard, and it can lead to valve failure. So whether the clearance is too small and you've got your valves open while the engine's running, losing compression and performance, and in the side of exhaust, leaving the exhaust valve open so it doesn't cool on the seat, that's a bad thing. Or if the clearance goes really big, then you've got trouble as well because the valve basically gets dropped onto the seat. So whether they're too small or too big, it can create problems, which is why you want to make sure they're all right. But as miracles go, these ones are okay. So what I'm going to do is pop the spark plug towers back in with a little smear of sealant round the O-rings, pop some new plugs in, pop the rocker cover back on, and that is one job on the ZXR done. Rocker cover is back on. I've put the timing cover back on as well. The gasket actually looked pretty good on it, so I've just put it back together. If it leaks when I actually run it up, I have got spares, just don't have them here, and it'd be nice to box the engine up today. Couple of little points to note. These 4 bolts hold the rocker cover down. They're only squashing some rubber. So there's rubber joints obviously around the outside and around the spark plug holes. And the aluminium they screw into is quite soft. So yes, there is a torque setting for them, but with these ones specifically, I'd always say just pull them with a spanner, and if you feel it beginning to give a little bit, stop, because you're pulling the thread out of it and you don't really want to do that. And the other point to note, which I should have pointed out while we had the cam cover off, is these bikes, they don't feed oil into the camshaft like they do on most modern stuff. They feed the oil supply to the journals along the actual cam cap, the bit that bolts the camshaft down. Because of that, there's a little pipe basically that joins all the cam caps together. So if you need to take the cams out to do valve clearances, you have to be really careful undoing the cam caps, because if they come off at a bit of an angle and twist, they can snap the pipes really easily, and the cam caps are machined with the cylinder head, and that puts you in a world of pain. And so if you are taking the cams out to do valve clearance change, then just you've got to be really, really careful and just back the cam cover, the cam carrier off just a tiny bit at a time so it comes up nice and evenly. And with a fairly hefty pile of bits behind me on the floor, and a ZXR in considerably less parts than when we started, that is the first afternoon on the bike done. But it's dark outside, so I'm going to hit the road and back on this in the morning. Thanks for watching, and join us again soon for some more ZXR fun.